Welcome to Clear Conversations, Entrepreneurial Legacies with your host, John Sleeting, an executive partner for Clearwater Capital Partners. Join John and his guests on this exclusive journey behind the scenes of extraordinary entrepreneurial families. In this series, we will dive deep into the stories of John's guests, who generously unveil the paths they've walked, the challenges they've overcome, and the wisdom they've gained along the way. Throughout these conversations, we explore their achievements beyond mere recognition, disclosing the distinctive perspectives that have shaped their entrepreneurial journeys. We hope you enjoy.
Hello, and welcome to Clear Conversations, the Entrepreneurial Legacies series. I'm your host, John Sleeting, and today I'm joined by Jae Haas. Jae is a CEO, entrepreneur, business person with a psychology, neuroscience undergrad, overlapping his focus on business, being accessible, being held accountable, leading and growing individuals in business enterprises. In this conversation, we're going to step back and think about the relationship between a family-founded and owned business and bringing in a non-family member chief executive officer into a relationship that continued to blossom and grow and lead into great business success, but more importantly, the why they did what they did and how they approached. But there's a secret sauce component to the relationship between the family, Jae and his family, that we're going to explore further. Jae, thank you so much for being here for this conversation. As we go through and explore, prior episode, we had John and Stacy Pizzaferro, and we'll come back to the relationship that you had with them. But I'm delighted now to step into this third part of this little mini series that I'm working through in terms of your view as the chief executive officer back working within this family business. You have various business experiences, but we're probably going to talk a little bit more in depth about the specific relationship that you had at Transnational. So with that, welcome, and I look forward to exploring this conversation with you.
Great. No, it's a pleasure to be here, and obviously flattered that you would think of me for this sort of an event. So thanks.
Oh gosh, well, I think so highly of you. I have so much great respect for you, and have just seen firsthand the great things and how you operate both in business and in family. So when we think about this concept of entrepreneurial legacies, we'll come back to the business side on the entrepreneurism, but legacies, what does that mean to you? How are you thinking about this concept of legacy?
Yeah, I mean, in some previous conversations that you and I have had regarding legacy, I think of it in kind of simple terms. I reflect on, concepts of accountability and accessibility. So in my own life and people that have interacted with me, I would very much like to be viewed in that sort of kind of consideration when I'm gone. I think being accountable and accessible, they seem like simple things, but they aren't always that simple. I think a lot of energy goes into trying to achieve that just on the daily. Yeah, certainly I like this concept of, like what I'm doing when people aren't looking and this kind of integrity play. I think it's a way to stay grounded, and I think it's a way to also then feed into the accountability and accessibility as well. So that's kind of how I think about my own personal legacy. Certainly the vehicle by which I would hope to pass on some of those same traits to my children and other folks that have been a large part of my life. I mean that means a lot to me. I care a lot for those relationships. You've seen some of that firsthand. But yeah, this just kind of in those simple terms, that's how I think about legacy.
So there's this aspect, and I'm going to accessibility, the availability and the accessibility first, and then come back to accountability, right? And how you hold yourself accountable. Because in the world these days, right, people have got their phones always on, right? People are always reaching out, contacting, email, messaging, needing meeting time, talking through, solving problems together in the office and at home, right? In terms of family and the kids and the intentionality. So how do you make yourself available, accessible to all these different individuals that want your time, and yet you're holding yourself accountable to preserve time for these different groups of individuals? How do you do that? How do you do that well?
Well, I mean, you hope to do it well. I mean, I think it takes you have to commit to being deliberate about it, in my experience, and just like anybody else. I mean, I fail at it too sometimes. My wife Melissa is a tremendous element in creating a pattern interrupt for me. Just like with anything else, maybe I'm there physically, but I'm not there mentally, and whatever the situation might be. And she does a great job of reminding me of those instances. Yeah, come on back. And I think I've learned over time. I've got even other folks in my life that will recognize that they feel comfortable enough to where they'll call me out, and I don't get offended by that. In fact, I think that's a blessing, and it's good to have those folks around, that I have that trust and confidence that are comfortable bringing it up if I do get off that path. But for the most part, I mean, I think it's a matter of just trying to be deliberate.
Now, did you actually invite people into that, or people are just close enough to you saying, "Hey, Jay, you're getting off track from what you say you want to do or who you want to be"?
No, I think there's an approach to trying to be authentic to the degree that you're approachable and you create a trusted environment where somebody has your best interest in mind, and it's based on trust that they're willing and interested to call that out. If it, not that it's problematic necessarily, but that they know that it's a commitment that I have within myself, and I'm just a human, and I'm going to get off course. And I've instilled a sense of appreciating when somebody is willing to step up, and hopefully there's an openness to that being reciprocated too. And I think that makes good friends and colleagues and family and all those things.
And do people then in the businesses respect boundaries back with the family and the family's understanding when you need to be doing things within the business? And how do you manage that interrelationship? I
think so. So in the context of business, I don't necessarily just prioritize that for myself. Within the appropriate context, I will also help people that I work with, particularly those that I'm in a position of leadership with, to have that, or to have access to that priority for themselves too. And that, again, that comes to openness and communication and relationship development. But there's an authenticity there that if it doesn't exist, it's very difficult, I think, to have those kinds of conversations and to create that ecosystem. But absolutely, I think the balance of family and work. I mean, the reality is, even if you're weighting the balance towards family, you're still probably spending as much time, if not more, with the folks that you work with.
Right.
And I think there's just a recognition of that situation that you have to be cognizant of.
So when you rewind in time and you go back to your own upbringing, how are some of these values instilled in you at a young age when you look back and growing up, and you grew up in Central Illinois? Share with listeners just a little bit more of Jeremiah Haas's backstory.
Yeah, Jeremiah. My mom would love you, by the way, for calling me Jeremiah. So, yeah, I grew up downstate Illinois in kind of a rural town. Both my parents grew up in the Peoria area, and it was interesting growing up. My parents gave me a tremendous amount of autonomy, and they were very present. I was very blessed to have parents that were very, very present. But they, I think they recognized that I went. I don't know if this is uncommon, but I think I wanted to mature at a faster rate, than maybe they would have otherwise been comfortable with, and they gave me that kind of ability, be it I don't know, like a summer, like when I was a freshman in high school, spending a bunch of time at a friend's lake house. Most parents probably wouldn't have signed up for that, but my parents did, and we got to do a lot of things, just kind of like outdoors and operating boats and just picking up summer jobs early, bailing hay, whatever it was. And in the moment, you don't think much about that, and I certainly kind of took that for granted. But my parents have been amazing to that regard in my life. So I think along with that came an availability from both of my mom and dad. Something as simple as I think that, think back to just some of these moments, but my dad would get up and cook breakfast for me. And then that turned into some of my friends would come over before school, and he would prepare breakfast for a bunch of us. And That's not normal, I don't think. I mean, at least to me, it didn't feel normal. It felt special. So,
Hmm.
I've got an infinite number of instances where I reflect on my parents and their patience. Probably I would say at the top of the list. It
Yeah.
was just their patience with me. And, I've tried to carry that, or maybe not even intentionally, but I think that has been carried forward in the way I operate.
And how you operate yourself.
Yeah.
And so growing up there, and then you looked at the University of Illinois for school, and have a very interesting undergraduate background in studies that has also served you well. And we'll come back to that connection too. But talk a little bit about your time then and at university.
Yeah. So actually, I went to Western Illinois for 2 years right out of school. I did ROTC there and played a little bit of football. Quickly realized that wasn't necessarily what made me tick, at least on the sports side. I mean, I'm competitive and love playing sports, but I knew that I wasn't going to get paid to play football. So I ended up meeting my wife, Melissa, at Western. So that was one of the best investments of time and money that I probably ever could have made. My parents helped with too. But ended up transferring to Champaign. I was on a science track. That's like my dad is a speech path, not in medicine per se, but kind of in and around. And my mom's a nurse. So I don't want to say it was like a preconceived notion, but it was to some degree that was my path. I came to that kind of on my own terms, but my parents, I think, had some influence there. Graduated from Champaign, had MCAT'd, and I had a semester off. I lost some hours when I transferred, so I graduated in December, and I was going to go back to school. Like that was the plan.
Okay.
And I literally fell into a job in the telecommunications space.
And your undergrad degree is in psychology.
Neuroscience. Yeah. So I spent most of my time at U of I in a lab, injecting mice full of, anesthetics. It was interesting. Certainly nothing to do with sales or business. So I graduated. I had this kind of time off, and I figured I should try to make some money while I was sitting around waiting to start back up at school. And like I said, I fell into this what ended up becoming a career in sales and in business. But it started we're sitting in a telecommunications building now, but it started with a competitor against AT&T.
Okay. And so when you look back then on your education, you look back and go, well, why was I doing that? I should have focused on business in school. Or how do you look back now in your formal education and say, here's how I'm leveraging that into business? Where do you see that intersection for yourself?
It was interesting. I mean, I remember kind of having the discussion with my parents that I was going to stay in business and not go back to school. It took a little bit of humility to have that conversation. It took some courage, I think, to have that conversation. God had a plan, has a plan, and I haven't regretted the way things have ended up, at any moment. But in terms of like reflecting on on my education itself, I mean, I don't know, like the content. I don't know, quite honestly, that I've really leveraged much of the actual content. Mm-hmm. Certainly, the process of going to class and studying and the discipline and getting up and doing the things that maybe you don't necessarily want to do all the time. Well, I think I had a lot of that coming into college, going back to kind of my earlier years. Mm-hmm. It surely like instilled and I think sharpened the sword to a degree. From a social perspective, I mean, I gained a lot of value in starting into school, transferring to another school. Just kind of reflecting on, I think that the value that I've picked up in school from a social perspective is probably as meaningful as the actual education itself.
And so going through your own educational experience and ending up having a career that's very different, and now you've got 4 children. Oldest is in college right now, kind of on down through their teen years. How do you encourage, coach them, guide them in their look at their formal education, realizing your path ended up going in a different direction? My path, right? I mean, I went to the U.S. Coast Guard Academy.
Yeah.
Right. Very different trajectory over life. How are you guiding and coaching your children regarding how they think about their formal education?
I think it's really hard, and I underestimated this before having kids, but just the pressure to want to plan everything and the pressure to create a safe environment that then probably crosses the line that doesn't actually create a safe place for our kids to fail. Like and we're not my wife and I are not perfect at this. My wife probably certainly better than I am, but kind of going back to, I think for us, like giving our kids an opportunity to have the autonomy to fail, not necessarily that they're doing it by choice, but just feeling that there is a safety net to a degree. There are certainly consequences based on off decisions. And my kids have varying degrees of like what North Star is to them. But yeah, I mean, I think it starts with that. It's just being present, being available, certainly having accountability in the house, but trying to create like some free space for these kids to make their own decisions, learn and figure it out, and maybe start them in a direction, but certainly not try to finish the direction for them. Yeah. And it's not easy,
for them to own it for themselves,
Yeah.
right, in their lives and their direction, and also going, life's going to have twists and turns in it. You can't pre-plan and solve all of these things in advance.
Yeah, and I think, I'm sure everybody's kids are this way too. Like, not all of my kids are good at the same things, and finding the balance of celebrating their individual wins without creating a competitiveness amongst those, those four kids that's not always easy too, because we may be celebrating, one thing that's very, very vastly different than it would be for one of my other children.
Right.
And it's a challenge. But
and you probably didn't set out, whether it be in school or even coming out of that into your early jobs, of saying someday I want to be the CEO of Transnational, right? I don't, being in fintech, payment space, all the great things you've done, you didn't set out at that in your early 20s, right? And how life evolves. So let's go there. How did you come to Transnational? A little bit of the backstory and the development of coming into that particular business, because that's the dynamic of that relationship that I want to spend a little bit more time on.
Sure. Kind of the abbreviated version of it is, so continuing on from that job in the telecommunications space, where I was really thrust into the management of people at I would say probably too early of an age. And it was a lot of just trial by fire and learning on the go, building the airplane in the air, if you will. In that business, it was a very transactional, kind of repetitive sale. The style in which the customers were supported on a post-acquisition basis, it started to wear at me a little bit. And I thought I wanted a longer sales cycle with a slightly more kind of sophisticated sales process. And I had some notion that I wanted to get into a more legacy kind of established business that wasn't necessarily a technology business, because I just fell into what was kind of a technology business. So I ended up at the railroad. So I went to the Burlington Northern Santa Fe for a few years, and it was part of like an early program they had for emerging markets. So we were going to typically manufacturers that had retired rail siding, and we were working with the local economic development groups, and we were helping them create funding to reinvigorate the rail siding that would then ultimately take trucks off the road and push those manufacturers to deliver product wherever they were sending it by rail. And I totally got what I asked for. I thought I wanted access to a big expense account. I wanted to travel and all these things, longer sales cycle. I got exactly what I asked for. And a few years into it, I was kind of succumbing to the reality that I was probably going to be at the railroad for a long time, because people stay there for a long time. And that was just kind of the trend. But I started to internally become a little remorseful about it. It was a great job. I was compensated very well. There were aspects of it that were kind of gratifying, but I wasn't really happy. But I didn't do anything about it. We had our house. I think it was on the market, but we were contemplating putting our house on the market. I was being asked to move to Fort Worth, which was the headquarters. And I get a phone call from a mutual friend of the founder of Transnational, John, and myself. His name's Brian. And he said, "Hey, would you be interested in having a dinner with John? He's looking for somebody to help, scale his organization." And I took that meeting. And the secret is I took that meeting interested to possibly avoid a move to Fort Worth, Texas. And
to compare and contrast the size and the scale and the scope, right?
Oh yeah.
The total employee base at that point in time at Transnational, or the size and the scope of the organization, was probably,
oh gosh, there was probably 180,000 employees worldwide at the BNSF, and Transnational, I think, maybe there were 6 employees
Right.
while I was at that dinner. Yeah.
So having a pretty dramatic change, what became attractive to you? Why did you say yes to the adventure that you were about to set out on?
Yeah, there was a long thought process. I mean, if I were to whittle it down to its kind of lowest common denominator, I felt the combination of my experience and my age warranted taking a risk. And then when you layer in the interactions I had had with John, and then you also couple that with some of the validation about John as a person through that mutual friend, Brian Olson, who we may talk about later. But that kind of the concoction of that ended up making this environment where I felt like it was the thing that's what I should do. And I can't tell you exactly why, but I that's where I ended up. And it just seemed like a risk that was worth taking.
And John had founded the business, right? So family owned, family founded business. He's operating that. Going from a big corporation to now a small family business at that point in time. What were the apprehensions, the questions you had in your mind? There's the excitement about diving in, and then there's also the, careful what you might ask for, right? You might get exactly what you want. What were the concerns? And if you were to go down a list of like the top 3, 4 type decision criteria that were on maybe the con side of it, but then how those pros outweighed those cons. How did you categorize that for maybe a listener out there that's considering and having that kind of same meeting with a founder, family-owned business that's being asked to step into a role? This was not the CEO role. This was the sales leader role. So coming into a position that wasn't the direct leadership, that was being run by John. How did you process that, right? What's the checklist that people should be asking themselves if they're in your shoes today?
Well, some of the cons, like from a tactical perspective, when I had just earlier stated that some of the reasons that I'd left the telecom business, not that much time had passed. So I did internally have some concerns that the business that John had founded and was running, there were a lot of similarities. But as I reflected on the similarities, I actually gained confidence. And I felt as if we would be collectively in a position with John to control some of the variables that I was a little dissatisfied with in the telecommunications business. And being that it was more ground floor, I could be a participant in that process, both operationally and just from a culture perspective. So what were some cons? I ended up like in my decision tree, they kind of slid over into pros, during the decision process. And I think those are some of the things that, as I think back, that John found valuable as we were having our early discussions. The things that I had learned to do, particularly in that telecom business, and then kind of layering in just other life skills and things that you pick up along the way. I think those were very attractive elements in John's eyes, because these are some things that I think Transnational at that time was challenged with. And I don't want to say I glazed over them, but I think I felt very comfortable and confident that there was a rinse and repeat that we could apply, to Transnational, and it would be successful. And John would tell you the story. He tells the story. It's a fun story that he does tell. But during some of the interview process, he kind of slammed his hands down to the table, and he's like, "Listen," he's like, I know you're young, you're building a family, and he's like, but if you don't perform, he's like, I will have no business getting you out of here, and I wasn't threatened by that, and it was actually kind of calming. I'm like, good, I like that there's accountability here, and there's expectations, and
it's being small and nimble, right, without the bureaucracy of the large, but yet having the disciplines, the accountabilities, process, sales disciplines that you brought in. Did you ever get to a point though, early on, and being like, what did I do? A little bit of, like you said, with going to the railroad, you paused and said, okay, careful what you ask for. You got exactly what you wanted. Did any of that ever creep in then during that time?
No, not really. Another thing that my dad might not even remember saying this. I haven't really brought this up with him, so maybe he'll listen to this. But I don't know if he said this repeatedly or maybe it was just a kind of a one and done comment, but I vividly remember him telling me in a conversation that you've got to love what you do. And at first, I think when I heard that, maybe I was a kid and it didn't really resonate. But then as I've reflected on that, that comment, maybe through college and even early in my career, I thought that meant I had to actually love the the work that I was doing specific to, they say, the industry or something like the market segment. But as I thought more about it, now, I mean, it is, you can kind of fill in the blank with whatever the product, the service, whatever the business is. I think loving what you do is, loving who you're working with. And also just the process that goes into the output. And I that happened very early at Transnational. Like, I loved the people that I was working with. I became very endeared to John early, and we'll probably talk more about that. Brian Olson that I'd mentioned, he ended up coming over to the business within the first 6 months. And I've always had a good relationship with Brian that, during the time period that he's been in my life, and I respect him tremendously. And then the other folks that we started kind of folding into the business, like, I just loved being around them. Yeah. So I didn't have any remorseful, like, what did I get myself into moments. A, we were busy, and B, I liked and loved the people that I was around. Right. So did I love the payment processing per se? Not necessarily. I found it intriguing.
Yeah.
It was more the people.
Technology challenges and everything but coming back to the people. So there is an aspect. And what's intriguing to me, being an outsider and knowing all of you guys now for quite some time, in these capacities that I am, right? I get a little bit of a front row to different aspects on the family side as well as in the business, and coming into that. And so there's an aspect where you guys have some secret sauce, right? So I know you can't disclose the recipe exactly what the secret sauce is, but how would you describe it? Because you do have a very unique relationship, right? There is something special. Like you talked about the breakfast around the table that your dad was making for everybody before going to school, right? You knew it was special, and it was different and it was unique. You have that too, as a group of businessmen together doing what you're doing. How do you describe that? And what makes it tick the way it does for you all?
Yeah. So I think there's one common thread, and it's something that John brought up early in our discussions. And it's something that I think I was maybe a little more unconscious of, but firmly believed in this sort of approach. And that's that I don't think it matters what business we've had or what business we'll be in. We view our customer, our first customer is our employee. So, or the folks that we're working with, I shouldn't even say employee. So if you build the model around, like, foundational around that thought, if everything that you're doing is servant minded and it's aimed towards creating an amazing experience with rails and discipline and accountability and all of the stuff that you need in order to have a functional business. But if you view that model that the folks that we're working with is our first customer, that's kind of the secret sauce. It sounds simple, and then you layer in things like, we laughed that Spike Lee already took this, but it's like, just do the right thing. It seems hard sometimes, but it really, if you go through the process of decision making, there's typically a pretty clear and evident, like, right answer. And
look, this is where common sense isn't so common, right?
Yeah, that's right.
For individuals. So doing the right thing, you guys always on the same page, and here's the right thing to do when it comes to the team members, customers. I mean, how do you ever get into debates of what is that right thing to do?
Yeah, it wasn't and isn't always rainbows and Skittles. I mean, like, but the one thing I think where there's never been, John and I have never had any conflict over why. I think if you look back over the course of time, I mean, I can't think of any instances where we were at odds about the why. I think the how and the what, for sure, there's different ways you can get there.
Yeah.
But not the why.
And how would you classify what that why was, even if it's unspoken, unwritten, but there was
some of
like-mindedness?
I think some of it was spoken and written to the degree that this idea of kind of like a Christian, running a Christian forward business, like a business that's rooted in just foundationally, like, good Christian principles. That's something that John is very kind of steadfast around, and that's part of the why, and for me that was a very easy why to buy into. Just going back to the comment about treating the folks that we were working with as our first customer, and really building an environment and process and tools and things that serve up that first customer first. That was part of our why. And that served us very well. Not making decisions that were only driving towards a financial outcome first. I think the money happens to come when you do all the other stuff, right. Right is relative, but those, like, that's how I would describe our why. And I think it was kind of uncompromising, be it written or unwritten. And John and I have always been in a lot of tandem on that.
Yeah. And so you fast forward, come in as at sales. So give a little bit of a time frame. Like, when did you and John start working together? And then let's start sizing that for individuals. You said 6 people back on day one. And what year was that?
It was like 2004.
Okay. And then you kind of move forward for the next 16 years together in terms of building the business, growing it. And you grew up sizable enterprise and you wanted to keep growing it. And so you did that for 16 years together. And when that time was up, you were in the CEO chair. So how do you go from coming in to, really small business, head of sales, to ending 6 years later with a much larger enterprise and also being the CEO? How did that happen, and how did those discussions play out between you and John?
The reflecting on it, it's very organic. I mean, I don't think there was never a moment where John said, I want you to be the CEO. And conversely, there was never a moment where I said, I want to be the CEO. I think that John, probably not unlike a lot of entrepreneurs and founders, is going to seek a balance that leans towards having more flexibility just on a personal basis, which I think is a great thing. I bought into that. I think John does amazing things with his time, be it in business or personal or philanthropic. So that was an easy thing for me to want to try to work towards and help facilitate. I viewed that as kind of like taking on more leadership. To me, was also making an investment in John, and we could talk about that too later. But an investment in John, in my eyes, has always been a really, really solid investment just for the humanity. I mean, John does amazing things, as you know, as well. So yeah, I think it was just an evolution over time. I think that it's like John learned to trust me with small things and became more and more comfortable wanting to trust me with, bigger elements of the business. And I did a good job of articulating what I could take on and areas where I needed help. And we've always been very communicative with each other, and we don't get offended if we criticize one another. I think that's one of the big valuable parts of our relationship. And it turned into kind of a good symbiosis where I think it was helping John and his family and just his own aspirations and those goals be achieved. And it felt good to me because I was hopefully empowering John towards some of those goals, and being a good steward of the business that we were creating and being able to honor the relationships we had. I mean, those are the things that make me feel really good.
But because that's such an interesting dynamic, because there is the risk, and this is what you didn't demonstrate. There's the risk of creating all this value, right? Taking it from 6 people to what it became, working down that path in terms of creating the economic and financial benefits and the wealth creation that was there. There's the risk that someone could get jealous regarding call it the pride, the ego of saying, look what I created, look what I did, but I'm doing it all for you, right? But that's not it at all. You saw that as actually empowering to turn around and say, well, no, if you did your work really, really well, right? Yeah, you knew that their family was benefiting from that, and that actually energized you, right? John gave you targets from a business viewpoint, and that energized you to say, no, I want to do 2 or 3 and 4x what you're challenging me to do. Was that intentional? Was that by design? Was that strategic on your end? That's just who you are and your character of how you operate, because that's unique. And again, these are parts of this secret sauce that come into play regarding who you are in the relationship back with John and who John is.
I think a lot of it's centered around self-awareness. I don't claim to be the most self-aware person, but there's some things I do feel like I have good self-awareness. And I think this is maybe one of those examples where I recognize that, John is and he uses this term too, he's a really good starter. He's a great idea guy. And he would, I think, say himself that he isn't always the best executor or tactician. And that's where we balance each other so well. And I recognize that very early. I think if I'm sparked with an idea from the outside, I thrive in an environment of executing towards that idea. And so there was never, and still isn't, a moment where it doesn't feel equitable to me. And going back to the trust, I trusted that John, with the kind of head start in business that he had on me by 8 or so years, 9 years, he operates with empathy, and I think he's servant-minded himself, as we, that interact with him know.
Yeah.
And I had some blind faith and trust in that, and I still do. So I get excited about like the things that have, come, from a financial and or flexibility perspective for John and the family. Like I like it. So I think it's kind of how I'm wired.
Yeah.
And I couldn't, like, foundationally, there has to be a relationship there that's built upon. I mean, I don't just freely give that away to folks in my life.
Right.
I mean, there's some element of that being earned, I think, to some degree, but it was not hard for John to do that with.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think John would be surprised by? He's listening, right? What do you think John would be surprised by from your viewpoint in the relationship and your observations of him that he may not even realize what those strengths are that you brought to one another? And you guys talk all the time, very open and transparent with one another. Is there anything that you're like, you know what, here's part of that secret sauce component of the relationship and the dynamic between the two of you? I don't
want to like leave your question kind of, flat of answer here, but we know, I feel like we know each other pretty well. And in instances where we don't, and there could be a surprise that I would give you an answer for here, we pause and ask each other.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and it's the communication though, that's so important because you guys are so open with one another.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would step back. You're so surprisingly open with one another in terms of the amount of information you share, both personally, professionally, business, and doing life together, and how that's evolved, right? It's absolutely a professional relationship, and it's absolutely a personal relationship. And I think that contributes to that secret sauce, the openness and the hey, everything's on the table. Everything's on the table with you guys always, again, from firsthand observation.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we both are very good at respecting that it is a business and a personal relationship, and we kind of know when to put what hat on. And neither of us, I think, have ever convoluted one for the other. Right. And we, for sure, neither of us, I think, have tried to extort or exploit one for the other.
Yeah, really healthy.
Yeah, it's really, very healthy.
It's really healthy. And Brian Olson,
absolutely, he's in that fold. Yeah.
And so you said there wasn't a moment where it's like, JB the CEO, but there's also organizational announcements. There's there are moments where things get declared. You ended up with ownership in the interest, so majority still John and the family, but you ended up with ownership interest. How did that dynamic play out, right? Again, because you're creating all this wealth and success and financial, for his family. You're doing it for yourself too, right? You're creating the opportunities for your family into the future as you do that. How did that dynamic play out?
Yeah, in typical John fashion, he beat me to the punch. Not that it was something that I was at any point in the journey like dwelling on or building anticipation around. It goes back to that blind faith. I felt like if I did a great job and kind of overexceeded John's expectations, purely on the business side, or like not necessarily thinking of it on a personal front, but that he would recognize that, and I had confidence that would have some value to him, and he would, decompress on what that meant for him and his family, and for the business, and for other folks, and when it was right for him and the timing was appropriate, that he would address it, and he did. Probably even a little earlier than I would have anticipated or expected. But so, like I said, typical John, like just his generosity and empathy, and where maybe sometimes he could be perceived as like, not paying attention or something like this. He's very intuitive, and he's very, very insightful, and he beat me to the punch.
Yeah, I describe him. He's so strategically generous. With philanthropic capital, he does that. But even in those moments of looking at that going, wow, if Jay is feeling great and Jay can be empowered and the team can be doing what they're doing, it's better to give away some ownership and have a smaller piece of a much larger pie that could be created through motivate, but very strategic, right? It's not just willy-nilly and throwing dollars around to charities or to, in business. He's so strategic in that. And there is so much to be learned from him. And so I want to go down this path of what advice would you give to other family businesses that are seeking to hire the next Jae Haas, right? And not that there could ever be another Jae Haas, right? But if they're in the process of saying, okay, we've got this business, we've got this idea, maybe we're a starter in that way, how would you counsel them to say, here's the things you got to be keeping in mind. If you want to try to get somebody like me, here's what you need to be doing as a family and a family business to bring in that outside non-family member talent in order to grow your business.
We didn't talk about this yet, but another thing that I think John has a knack for is just being transparent. So I think anytime you're working within a family typed business or structured business, there's always kind of this notion of like, what's behind the curtain? John has done a great job, the way we've approached our financials, the way he's like probably overly forthcoming just with his own, kind of even with me, his personal finances and things like this. I think, again, he kind of heads these curiosities off at the pass. So I think the advice that I would give to a family that's considering bringing a non-family member in to play a significant role in the business is just first decide that you like what your rails and what your level of comfort is in terms of your ability or interest to be transparent. And if for some reason the family is erring on the side of thinking there has to be a little bit more cloak, then I think you just have to plan for that, and that has to be there has to be a thought process that goes into that. Versus if the family feels comfortable and there's enough of a trust factor, that's built with the person that they're going to bring into the business, where they do feel more comfortable with a higher level of transparency, I think that goes a long way. It's certainly not like expected per se, but I think it does. It's an olive branch to a degree that it ends up answering a lot of questions, and I think it builds a foundation.
And so the technical competencies of the ability to lead, run the business, from heading sales to being a chief executive, that has to be there. But these are the intangibles, right? This is the secret sauce becomes the intangibles, which are the relationship, the transparency, the communication, the everything on the table, so that you can go off and do what you do, which the family benefits from at that point in time.
That's right.
How important is the relationship back with the extended family? Because you and John are really deep in the family. How important was it for you to know Stacy, the kids, next generations, and how important was that from John's perspective, without putting words in his mouth, right? In terms of you getting to know his family, him getting to know your family.
It's important to the degree that, like, I've never measured it. I've never really thought about it, but going back to the transparency and just the openness of our relationship with each other, I feel like I've had a front row seat in his kids growing up, and he's consulted with me on things about his kids and just fatherhood, and I've done the same, so it going to that comment of just doing life together, so that not every conversation is only about the business or about challenges within those four walls, but we're being helpful to each other in kind of all aspects of our life. I mean, that it goes a long way, but again, you don't necessarily. I mean, it's just one of those things. Like, you don't necessarily think about that while it's happening,
right?
But it's how you have an authentic relationship with someone, I think. So,
And so other individuals that might be out there at large companies, railroads, right? I mean, I was at GE Capital, right? I came over to Clearwater. It was just John Chapman, and you know what? I was a client, and now here I am. And so when you think about individuals going from these large organizations to family-owned businesses, what would your counsel be to them as they're going through their decision process of all the pros and cons that could be lining up on their page to make sure that they're asking the right questions about? What would those questions be, right? You have your antenna up and be aware of these sort of dynamics. What are some of those items down the checklist for for the non-family member future CEOs that are out there?
Yeah, I would encourage those folks to be, I mean, you have to work on self-awareness and know what makes you tick. I think it's easy within a large organization, and not out of malice or some ill will, to kind of hide to the degree that you can operate in your silo within a large organization. You can, in some instances, have kind of a lot of control in a very finite environment within your kind of area of jurisdiction. There's typically very well-defined process and protocol within these large organizations. That isn't necessarily the same at a small business, and I particularly like some family businesses. So I think you've got to be prepared to kind of like roll with the punches to a degree, but that goes back to kind of the why and like why you're getting involved.
Yeah.
So you have to have a self-awareness, because if you aren't ready for that or prepared for that or just aren't wired that way, it could probably be very frustrating, I would think.
So I'm speaking to a group at a peer forum coming up in a few weeks. And it's with individuals that are representing families. It's with individuals not in the family. And the consideration is coming around, how do we take our very senior executive leaders within these different organizations and compensate them? And how do you think about equity? How do you think about, phantom stock, profits interest pools, go down the list of all the non-qualified, plans on top of qualified plans? How important was it for you to have direct equity versus some other incentive plan versus how does that shift the potential mindset as a family may be considering? How do we give away equity? Is that important? How do we align an incentive plan so that these lead executives are also benefiting from the prosperity being created?
Yeah, at least I don't want to speak for others, but for me, I think the notion of like winning together is really important. It's hard to watch, I think, maybe other factions of ownership or a family or equity holders kind of celebrate when there's wins happening, and if you're not somehow participating in that, I mean that's tough. That would be a lot to ask, I think, or expect of anyone. So it's just, I don't know exactly what the structure has to be. I don't think there's a right answer or one answer, but I think creating an environment where the family and key executives can be winning together is important, and it should be equitable. And just the idea that I think if you're an executive and you're seeking employment at a family-owned business, and you're expecting to kind of get compensated when the winning isn't happening, or prior to the winning having a chance to happen, that's not necessarily equitable either. And I think you have to be prepared to know that the family may not be interested or willing to take that risk, and just be respectful of that.
Yeah.
So, but for me, I was okay with the idea that if we weren't in a position to be getting paid, or the timing wasn't yet there, but it was coming.
Yeah.
I was comfortable with that, and I think in hindsight, it's been very important.
So if you go through that 16 years, and in 2020, there was a monetization event in terms of the business. Can you walk through a little bit of that and the decision process leading up to that, the dialogue, how that plays out? Give people a peek behind the curtain regarding the dynamics of how you think about then taking that next step as an organization, which sometimes in succession means, an exit event. So
I think, so this story or this situation will kind of speak to this idea that you have to be willing to not utterly and completely, but for the most part, be supportive of the founder or the family. When we were building Transnational, so there's kind of this concept of either building the business to play a finite game or to play an infinite game. Finite business build typically centered around an exit in mind, versus the infinite business build. You're just trying to stay in the game as long as you can and stay relevant to your clients, to your partners, to your stakeholders, to your employees. We very much were building and had continued to build Transnational from an infinite perspective. Some things occurred. I think time passes. Just some other elements with John where, maybe some market considerations. He went from kind of being very infinite in his mindset with the business to a little bit more finite. I think that was maybe a a little bit of a miss, but I think we're all like, none of us are remorseful about it. I think we're all comfortable with the idea that we didn't necessarily optimize the sale of Transnational by virtue of planning for that specifically with 5 years of advance notice or something. We happen to be in a business where I think valuations are generally kind of favorable and multiples are typically strong. But yeah, I mean, so I was supportive of John's decision. It felt like it was founded in all of the right kind of reasons, and going back to the why. John was very steadfast on our deal having to have certain properties and elements. Like we weren't interested in some crazy kind of tangled earn out or, kind of rolling the bones on some other controlling interest that where we were losing control and expecting that the business was going to succeed on, only on, folks outside of ourselves kind of decision making. So we were able to find a deal that kind of met some of that criteria, and they came to us first. I think that's always a good concept, and we had a very favorable outcome, and it was all good.
So the finite versus the infinite, right? Because I think there are certain things you would do to set up for an exit within the business to make it attractive to an outside investor. What I encourage a lot of business, especially business operators, and back with their operating families, you already have an equity holder, right? You should be developing a great company for your current investors, and if your current investors are really happy, a future investor is also going to be very happy. And how you do that with excellence, and so that back and forth, right? The finite and the infinite of creating a great company that's attractive to existing owners, you all, but also attractive to other participants in the market that might step in and say, "Wow, this is a great business. How do we actually even grow it even more?" So in that finite versus infinite thought process, did you feel that there were certain things that had to shift as you were setting up for an exit?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of our disciplines around reporting, and I mean, there's some very tactical things that I feel like shifted. The lens by which we would use to measure the performance of the business, and kind of our expectations, and just the notion that we really, our competitor was like, we kind of viewed our competitor as ourself. Like we drove ourselves towards kind of a good, healthy, competitive kind of approach to the business. So I think some of that did shift. I mean, it kind of had to. You get an investment banker in there, and they're going to want to look at that through a different lens. We were a reasonably flat organization, so that there was some calorie burn there for sure. The cadence and the style of meetings that we would generally have had prior to engaging in a process, I mean, that certainly changed. But from a culture perspective, I mean, outside of some of the tactical things, we really didn't change anything. Specifically going to that, to that earlier comment about like why you're making decisions to do certain things. I think if we had multiple years to prepare, from a pricing strategy perspective, from a just expense and COGS management, we probably would have approached things a little bit differently, a lot differently, maybe not so much, but a little differently, I think we would have.
And there's also some strategic moves along the way too. When the My Well ministry was created and got carved out as a separate 501c3 entity from the core business. Again, a very strategic item and strategic action that took place years before there was an exit, right? And probably even sometime before an exit was contemplated at that point, just to have that, and also strategic for tax reasons and financial reasons and service reasons, and back to the why and how you do that well. Again, we're John, with you, so strategic when we step back and look at that and how to think about those sort of actions before an event. Other individuals, families out there that are considering, our exit is not going to be internal family succession or an ESOP or different tools that could be used. It's going to be an outright liquidity event. What would you be encouraging those families and executives to prepare for when they're going through their first large liquidity event?
Depending upon the size of the business and the culture, I mean, there is going to be a culture shift. You hear people talk about this. We had, folks even kind of educating us, I think, on it leading up to the sale of Transnational. And I would say be more curious about that earlier in the process, such that it will afford you the ability to be a little more decisive around things relating to how attached to the business does the family intend to be post-sale. I think just furthering your education and your exposure to some of those elements, I think may just change some ways that you approach the sale.
Okay.
That would probably be the first thing. The second thing is just the preparedness. I mean, it's hard. It was a lot of anguish. I again, front row seat with John and his own mentality around it. I certainly had still have my own challenges with kind of like letting the baby go to some degree. And it's not just the business. I mean, the business represents a lot of relationships and just things that you've poured yourself into, and it's hard, and so I think
not just a financial transaction.
No, it is not. So you have to muster up the energy to be ready for that. Having, I think, the right folks around you, I think, is very important. Creating a transparent, set of discussions around, again, going back to the why, and just leaning into those relationships, I think, is really important.
Yeah, and there's and the testament to your friendship relationship, right? Going through all of that, you're still great friends to this day. I mean, there's aspects of it you're still talking all the time, and family aspects and the dynamics, and still building into one another to this day, which is a real testament to the relationship that you built during that 16-year period. Through this event and the equity and your own wealth creation, how's that had you thinking about this concept now of wealth, right? And the financial success that you've realized back for your own family, because you realized it for the family you were serving, right? And that winning together, you also win through this process. How has that shaped your thoughts regarding this concept of wealth management, if you want to call it that?
I mean, I think it brings to light, like, just the concept of stewardship and taking that more seriously as you accumulate some wealth. It certainly has inspired me to want to share the benefits of that sort of an experience with folks. So, I mean, I don't think we're done in business. I'm very, very motivated to find ways and to help create a structure or an environment where, I can help be part of that process for other people too. In fact, I think it would be a huge failure if I can't accomplish that. So, those are kind of the two big things that stick out to me.
So when I juxtapose how you just responded versus some others that say, after my event, I'm, retiring, I'm not going to be involved with anything else. I'm going to go golfing, fishing, out on the boat, whatever it might be. But you're saying that's not the path for you. What do you think motivates you to say, yeah, that's not the path for me? I'm really motivated to go off and continue to create and build.
I don't know, maybe just how I'm wired. Brian and I have this discussion. Like, I think that's just kind of what we have our sights on now, like, to some degree. It just seems like it would be poor stewardship to not take those experiences and that success and to find a way to share that. Now granted, I think on the other end, you've got to expect that you're going to have somebody kind of at the table with you that is motivated and interested and driven to some degree. But yeah, trying to pay it forward. To me, it'd be a huge miss. Going back to your legacy comments too, like, that would be a big miss if I can't find a way to help create, influence, whatever, in as many folks as I can. And not even like thinking about my own children per se, but just anyone that has been of benefit to me in my career or my life, that I can help provide value to. Like, that's very motivating to me.
And how does it change back within your own family, right? With your kids, the dynamic, again, this realization of company sold, there's resources that come out of that. How aware are they of that? How much do you talk about that? Is there, does life change? How do you keep the kids grounded like you were grounded growing up as we opened? How intentional are you, Melissa?
Yeah, we don't talk about that really in our family much. I think, if you interviewed my 4 kids and they were asked like grade your father's success or something like that, you probably get all sorts of varying answers. And I don't even know that all 4 of my kids could say exactly what I do. Some days I don't even know what I do. So I wouldn't expect for them to be able to articulate it. No, yeah, we don't really talk about it. I certainly don't think of any of it as theirs, like I think by proxy, they have access to some things. But the one thing I wanted them to know, and be the most kind of steadfast on is they have access to me and their mom, so there's no amount of money I think that, can buy a minute of time necessarily. But I think to a degree, my kids maybe will later reflect on the fact that I've been maybe that much more available and accessible to them.
So if we had the 4 kids around the table, right? What do you think that they would say about their dad? And I'm only saying that with you here, right? If Melissa's here, I'd say about their mom and dad. Right?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. I don't know. I think I have a hunch about what they would each say from a business perspective.
Just
generally
from a who you are person.
I don't know. It's like, how do you sum up your dad? It's hard, and I'm sure I might get a different answer if I weren't in the room too. So
well, and this where everyone's got different relationships, right? And with their fathers, and there's great ones, and there's ones that are very troubled, and yet we're aspiring to, right, or trying to be something that's a father figure, right, a coworker figure, a customer when you're the customer of something on the other end of it. How you live out that life is a testament to who you are. And when I think about that legacy component, it's the totality of who you are. It's not even defined by the dollar amounts. It's not defined by the business success or what that means. And it's also, not just, it's the totality of who you are as a person and everyone you're coming in contact with and the impact that you're leaving. And Jay, I've shared this with you before, right? I think you are a fantastic example of a father who's got I hate saying can do it all, but bringing together the accountability, the self-accountability with respect to I'm going to be available and leading the team and leading the business and serving our customers and what we're doing. And I'm going to be available I've got to be here at 5:00 because I'm coaching this. I'm going to be here on Saturday morning because I'm doing this with the kids. I mean, we're going to be taking this 2-week, vacation, and here's where we're going here and there. You have integrated all of that together, actually in a fantastic way, if I'm allowed to say that, sitting in the bleachers watching, that is, I think, part of your legacy that will pay itself out into the future too.
Guys John's been a huge part of that. He's been very supportive of that. And I think we both recognize that there's a trade-off there. Like, could Transnational have been some incremental amount more valuable if some of that would have been traded the other way? I think probably so, but we're both, at least I don't want to speak for John, but I think we're both comfortable with that. I certainly am.
So well done. Well done. As you look forward then, as we start wrapping up, as you think, about that future and what you want to build and if you were to go back to yourself 20 years ago, going on 20 years ago, well, it is 20 years ago now, right?
Yeah.
That you and John first met. To those individuals that are 20 years younger right now at that point in their career, what would you be encouraging your younger self to be out doing, thinking about? What would you maybe think about differently, and how you would frame the decisions, just given time and experience and life wisdom at this point?
Yeah, I could be stubborn about things. So I think the advice I'd give myself is maybe just be a little more open, and John has instilled this in me, and it's actually fun to watch, but like, be a little more risk tolerant. Like, I don't consider myself to be super risk tolerant, and again, I think that's the balance of John and I too, is, where he's maybe a little more tolerant towards risk, not like, crazy, blatant, just absurd type of risk, but he's willing to give things a shot, maybe in some instances where I'm not. And I think we balance each other kind of well there, but I think I'm not regretful. There's not a whole lot that I would want to change. I feel like God's got a plan. I feel very blessed, and so I don't know. Things happen for a reason.
Yeah,
I wouldn't want to change much of that.
Yeah, well, that's a great place to be, right? As you continue to look forward, and hopefully with many years and decades. So go ahead and wrap it up. Closing thoughts for listeners.
Well, you've made these comments about, like, I've done some things well. Like, I view that I'm just a product of the people that I've been blessed to be surrounded by. Like, you're on that list. So like sometimes I don't even feel like I'm my own person. I'm just a product of all of those instances of interaction I've had with folks. And, you know, that's like, I can't take credit for that. Like, you know, my wife, Melissa, I mean, like, she's my best friend, you know, I don't know what I would do without her. And keeps me grounded. She's grounded. She makes me a better husband. She makes me, you know, a better partner to John, all those things. And yeah, I just, you know, just be present. I think that's where I would close things. It's just, and I have to focus and try at it too. I know everybody's challenged with it, but just be present.
Great closing words. Thank you, Jay, again for joining in this conversation. Thank you, listeners, for taking the time to listen to Jay's just fantastic story and getting a little bit of a flavor of the individual of who he is. If you want to continue the conversation, please send us an email at clearconversations@ccpwealth.com. Thanks and have a blessed day.
Thanks.